Picture this. The year is 1502 and Rome, swollen with power and menace, seems to pulse like a living creature. The Vatican's corridors are draped in silks and velvet torchlight, throwing long shadows over frescoed walls where saints gaze down with hollow eyes. The air is thick, heavy, with the perfume of spiced wine, roasted peacock and burning incense. It is the night of a wedding, one of glittering splendour, and yet beneath the gold leaf and music something metallic lingers. It is the taste of blood, of steel, of power, sharpened into spectacle. At the centre of this night sits Lucrezia Borgia, the daughter of Pope Alexander VI. She is only 22, her hair shining like molten gold beneath her bridal veil, her gown a marvel of silk and pearls that catch the candlelight as though the heavens themselves have been stitched into fabric. To the onlookers she appears the perfect bride, graceful, composed, luminous. Yet everyone here knows this union is not the culmination of love. It is the latest move in a deadly game, a marriage not of two souls but of two dynasties. Around her, the Vatican's great halls swell with bodies. Cardinals, envoys, noblemen and mercenaries jostle for position, each pair of eyes calculating what this marriage might mean for their fortunes. Servants glide silently through the throng with platters of exotic fruits and gilded chalices. Musicians strike up tunes that weave laughter through the crowd, but even the music has an edge brittle as glass. The guests laugh, yes, but their glances are sharp, their smiles brittle, as though everyone present understands that joy here is merely another mask. Rome in this age is not the serene cradle of Christendom painted in devotional books. It is a viper's nest. Poisonings at banquets, daggers in darkened streets, alliances made and unmade overnight. Every feast is a battlefield, every wedding a declaration of war in silk and satin. Tonight is no exception. The Borgias, a family whispered about with dread and fascination, are staging a spectacle to secure their power. Lucrezia, their daughter, is the bride. Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, is the groom. And all of Italy holds its breath to see whether this marriage will bind two powers together or drive them further apart. The Pope's presence saturates the hall, though he does not dance. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, sits enthroned like a lion among jackals, his face sagging with age yet still radiating authority. His son Cesare, the infamous Duke of Valentinois, prowls the room like a hawk disguised in velvet, watching the envoys of Ferrara with narrowed eyes. Between father and son, Lucrezia shines like a carefully polished jewel. She is their offering, their bargaining chip, their living guarantee. The crowd knows her story, twice married before, twice abandoned to rumour and tragedy. Her first husband humiliated by annulment, accused of impotence in a charade that destroyed his honour. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, strangled after surviving a brutal stabbing, his blood still echoing in whispers of Cesare's hand behind the deed. Now at 22, Lucrezia sits poised at the centre of yet another gamble. The Ferrara alliance could secure the Borgias against their rivals, or collapse under suspicion. Tonight, the Este family has come prepared. They are not dazzled by feasts or flattery. Old, proud and deeply suspicious, they see the Borgias as upstart schemers whose name reeks of ambition and scandal. They will demand more than vows and banquets to seal this bond. Behind their watchful eyes lies a demand so grotesque, so unthinkable, that even in this world of intrigue it will shock the courtiers who whisper of it later. But for now the feast continues, the music plays, and the Vatican gleams like a stage set for a play in which every actor knows their lines. For Lucrezia there is no illusion of choice. The candles flicker across her calm, practiced smile, but her heart beats to a rhythm older than politics. She knows her body is not hers tonight. It is a ledger, a guarantee, a parchment of flesh upon which the survival of her family will be written. And as she raises her goblet to the applause of the hall, she understands that this is not the beginning of a marriage. It is the opening act of a performance where humiliation and power will dance hand in hand. This is Rome at its most dazzling and most dangerous a place, where the scent of roses mixes with the stench of fear. And on this night in the Vatican halls glowing with light, the young woman who has been pawn widow and daughter will step once more into the role carved for her by men of power. Only later will history recognise that she is also learning how to survive, how to endure, and how to transform even the most intimate humiliation into the foundation of a throne. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? To understand the weight of the moment in 1502, you must look backward into the shadows of Lucrezia Borgia's brief yet blood-stained history. She was only 22, but already twice a wife, twice cast adrift by the ambitions of her family. Each union had been forged not from affection but from calculation, and each had ended in ruin. Her first marriage came when she was scarcely more than a girl. In 1493, at just 13, Lucrezia was married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a match arranged by her father, Pope Alexander VI, to secure an alliance with one of Italy's great families. At first, it seemed a prudent union. The Borgias would gain the prestige of the Sforza name, while Giovanni would bask in papal favour. But in Italy's ceaselessly shifting game of alliances, yesterday's friends quickly became today's burdens. When Cesare Borgia cast his eyes toward France and new military power, the Sforza connection lost its shine. The annulment came swiftly and cruelly. Giovanni Sforza was accused of impotence, a charge not merely humiliating but devastating in Renaissance society. To be declared sexually inadequate was to lose not just a marriage, but one's honour, manhood and lineage. Whether the claim was true mattered little. What mattered was that it freed Lucrezia for another more useful match. Giovanni, humiliated, spat his revenge by spreading darker rumours that the real reason for the annulment was incest, that Pope Alexander and Cesare themselves desired Lucrezia. These whispers spread like wildfire, staining her name in ways she could never wash away. She emerged from her first marriage not a blushing maiden, but a public scandal, a pawn whose body had been turned into a weapon of ridicule. Yet worse awaited her. In 1498 she was remarried, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscay, a bastard son of the Neapolitan royal house. Contemporary sources say that unlike her first union, this marriage carried traces of genuine affection. Alfonso was young, handsome, and by most accounts kind. For a fleeting moment, Lucrezia seemed to touch something like happiness, but the Borgias were never permitted the luxury of sentiment. By 1500, Cesare Borgia's political ambitions clashed directly with Alfonso's Neapolitan ties. The French crown, Cesare's great patron, warred with Naples, and suddenly Alfonso's bloodline was no longer an asset, but a liability. One evening, as Alfonso walked the Vatican steps, assassins attacked. He was stabbed savagely, left bleeding but alive. Lucrezia tended to him with devotion, turning her chambers into a sick room, refusing to abandon him. For weeks she nursed him, whispering words of comfort, praying he might survive. But in July, Cesare's will proved stronger than her prayers. Alfonso was strangled in his bed, his recovery cut short by invisible hands. Rome whispered, as Rome always did, and no one doubted who had ordered it. Cesare, the brother who loved Lucrezia with a possessive devotion that defied familial boundaries, had decided her husband must die. And so he did. Lucrezia, at 19, found herself widowed again. Twice given, twice discarded. First through humiliation, then through murder. Both times her family's ambitions had demanded the sacrifice of her dignity, her happiness, and perhaps even her innocence. She was learning painfully that her fate was never her own. She was a coin of alliance, a vessel of fertility, a promise written in flesh and broken when politics required it. And yet through these ordeals something hardened within her. She began to understand the rules of the game. Each time she was thrust back into the marketplace of marriage, she carried not only the wounds but also the lessons. She learned how men wielded shame as a weapon, how rumours destroyed reputations, how affection could be twisted into danger. So when she entered the Vatican halls again in 1502, ready to marry Alfonso de Este of Ferrara, she did not come as an innocent bride. She came as a woman forged in the fire of betrayal, her heart scarred, her name already infamous. She knew too well that her wedding night would not belong to her, but she also knew that even humiliation could be turned into leverage. This was her history: annulment, rumour, blood and loss. A history that would trail her like a spectre into Ferrara's proud court, where her body would once again be tested, and where she would be forced to find within the ashes of her past the iron of her survival. To understand why Lucrezia's every move was shadowed by suspicion, one must first step into the reputation of the house she was born into. The very name Borgia struck both fascination and dread across Renaissance Europe. It was a name whispered with relish in courts and taverns alike, the shorthand for ambition, unchained for power, acquired not through divine right but through audacity, cunning and blood. At its head stood Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, a man whose election in 1492 sent shockwaves through Christendom. His ascension was not sung as a miracle of the Holy Spirit, but condemned as the triumph of gold and manipulation. Contemporary chroniclers accused him of bribing cardinals with mountains of wealth offices and promises securing the papal throne not through piety but through sheer force of corruption. And once seated on the throne of St. Peter, Alexander VI ruled as both pontiff and patriarch of his clan, wielding the church's authority as though it were a private kingdom. His son Cesare Borgia was the blade to his father's sceptre. Once a cardinal, Cesare abandoned the robes of the church for armour, trading a bishop's mitre for a soldier's helm. With the backing of the French king and the papal treasury, he carved a swath across central Italy, subduing city after city with ruthless efficiency. His tactics became the stuff of fearful legend, enemies lured with promises of pardon only to be strangled, allies kept loyal with terror more than trust. Niccolo Machiavelli, who met Cesare and observed him closely, would later hold him up as the model of a new kind of prince cunning, decisive, unburdened by morality, a man who understood that cruelty when used swiftly and calculatedly could secure power more firmly than mercy. But it was not only politics that gave the Borgias their notorious aura. Gossip clung to them like smoke spreading through pamphlets, ballads and whispered tales. Rome was intoxicated with scandal, and the Borgias provided endless fodder. The family was accused of hosting orgiastic feasts in the Vatican itself, banquets where dancers performed naked, where tables groaned with exotic fruits and forbidden pleasures. Most infamous of all was the Banquet of Chestnuts, a night where, according to lurid rumour, courtesans crawled on all fours to collect chestnuts thrown across the floor while cardinals and noblemen indulged in debauchery under papal eyes. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or invented mattered little. The damage was in the telling. And at the centre of this swirl of rumour stood Lucrezia. Her father's doting and her brother's obsessive closeness became fertile ground for darker whispers. Was she not only pawn, but also partner in their corruption? Chroniclers hostile to the Borgias whispered of incest stories of Lucrezia sharing her father's son's bed, or bearing a mysterious child whose paternity was shrouded in scandal. None of these accusations can be proven, yet they were repeated so often that they etched themselves into her legend. To her enemies she was not simply the Pope's daughter, but a temptress, a Borgia Venus whose beauty was a mask for poison. Indeed, poison was another instrument woven into the Borgia myth. Tales spread of rings with hidden compartments of goblets tainted with unseen death of enemies, collapsing at feasts after sipping too eagerly from papal wine. The very idea of being invited to dine with the Borgias carried menace, as though every morsel might be a trap. Some contemporaries swore by these tales. Others dismissed them as slanders invented by jealous rivals. But in the court of public opinion, the Borgias became inseparable from the spectre of poison masters of both sensuality and death. This reputation was both weapon and curse. On one hand, it cloaked the family in fear-deterring open rebellion. On the other, it stained even their legitimate moves with suspicion. Allies hesitated, rivals plotted ceaselessly, and any misfortune, a sudden illness, a marriage annulled, a noble slain in the street was immediately attributed to Borgia treachery. For Lucrezia, this legacy was a double burden. She was at once adored for her beauty and distrusted for her blood. When she arrived in Ferrara as bride to Alfonso d'Este, the court did not see her as a woman of 22 bruised by 2 tragic marriages. They saw the daughter of Alexander VI, the sister of Cesare, the living embodiment of the Borgia taint. Her very presence carried the weight of scandal, her every smile scrutinized for deceit. It was in this crucible of gossip, rumour and fear that Lucrezia learned her most vital lesson in a world where truth could be twisted into weaponry. Survival depended not on denying rumour but on mastering it. The Borgia name was infamous, yes, but with the right skill even infamy could be sharpened into a shield or wielded like a blade. To grasp the stakes of Lucrezia's third marriage, one must step into the marble corridors of Ferrara and understand the house she was about to join. The Este family, sometimes written as Estensi, was everything the Borgias were not. Where the Borgias were whispered about as upstart Spaniards who clawed their way into Italy's power structures with bribes and daggers, the Este lineage stretched back centuries, their nobility woven into the very fabric of northern Italy. Ferrara itself was no provincial court. Nestled in the fertile Po Valley, its duchy was both gateway and buffer, a jewel balanced precariously between Venice to the east, Milan to the west, and the papacy to the south. Its position made it coveted ground in Italy's endless wars. Whoever held Ferrara could either block or open the routes between powers, making the duchy an indispensable player in Renaissance diplomacy. The Este had long mastered the art of survival in this treacherous landscape. They were a house as proud as marble and as cautious as stone. Through centuries of marriages, treaties and military manoeuvres, they had preserved their duchy's independence in the face of giants. Their court was renowned not only for politics but also for its refinement. Ferrara had become a beacon of humanist learning, a patron of music and painting, a place where poets like Ariosto and scholars like Guarino da Verona found protection. To be an Este was to belong to an old aristocracy steeped in prestige and cultural grandeur. Alfonso d'Este, the groom awaiting Lucrezia, embodied this heritage. Born in 1476, he was heir to Duke Ercole, a man of formidable cunning and brother to Isabella d'Este, the famed First Lady of the Renaissance. Unlike Cesare Borgia's mercurial brilliance, Alfonso's strengths were steady and practical. He was no dazzling orator, nor flamboyant warrior, but he was reliable, a man who understood fortresses, artillery, and the balancing act of survival. Those who knew him described a quiet reserve, even a coldness, as though he had inherited from Ferrara itself the caution that kept the duchy alive. For the Este, Lucrezia's arrival was cause for deep ambivalence. On one hand, an alliance with the papacy promised invaluable protection. Pope Alexander VI's blessing could shield Ferrara from Venice's greed or Milan's aggression. On the other hand, to bind themselves to the Borgias was to invite scandal into their halls. Where the Este name evoked stability, dignity, and ancient pride, the Borgia name conjured poison lust and ruthless ambition. Among Ferrara's courtiers, whispers swirled before the wedding. Was this union a lifeline or a trap? Would Alfonso be strengthened by papal gold or consumed by Borgia infamy? Chroniclers in Ferrara describe the court's reluctance. Duke Ercole, though pragmatic, resisted until the very end, reluctant to tarnish his house with what many saw as papal corruption given flesh. It was in this tension that Alfonso prepared to meet his bride. He knew of her reputation annulment scandal blood. He knew her family's power as irresistible as it was dangerous, and he knew that in a world where lineage meant everything, he would be expected to both protect his family's honour and absorb the taint of hers. Thus the stage was set for a clash not only of two individuals but of two legacies. The Borgias, brash and feared, rising on the back of scandal and ambition. The Este, ancient and proud, wary of sullying their noble name with papal intrigue. Their union would not be a marriage in the ordinary sense. It was a gamble on survival, a test of whether Ferrara's marble pride could withstand the fire of Borgia ambition, or whether in binding themselves to Lucrezia the Este were inviting the serpent into their garden. The marriage of Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este was not in its essence about affection or desire. It was necessity raw and undeniable that bound Ferrara to the Borgias in 1502. The Este family, proud and wary, understood the map of Italy with a clarity born of centuries of survival. Every duchy, every principality was a pawn in the greater struggle between empires, France, Spain, the papacy, and the German emperor. To navigate these waters without drowning required alliances that were as uncomfortable as they were unavoidable. For Ferrara, the situation was especially precarious. Duke Ercole. I had spent his reign threading the needle between the encroaching power of Venice and the ambitions of Milan. With France pressing into Italy from the north and the papacy flexing its authority from the south, Ferrara could not remain aloof. The Borgias, through Pope Alexander VI, offered something no other family could direct: papal protection. An alliance with the Pope's daughter meant papal favour, papal money, and perhaps most importantly papal legitimacy. For a small duchy surrounded by hungry giants, that blessing could spell survival. Yet the price of such protection was steep. The Este family viewed the Borgias with disdain, their rise too rapid, their methods too scandalous. Where the Este cultivated an image of refinement and old nobility, the Borgias carried the stench of corruption, bribes, poison, and whispered sins. To marry their heir to a Borgia daughter was to risk contamination of reputation. But necessity pushed aside pride. As Venice threatened expansion and Milan and France shifted alliances like quicksand, Ferrara needed a shield. The papacy was that shield, and Lucrezia was the token of its promise. Still, distrust remained like a splinter. The Este had watched Lucrezia's previous marriages dissolve, one annulled under the grotesque claim of impotence, the other shattered by murder. Both episodes suggested instability, scandal, and the shadow of manipulation. They feared that should their union with her falter, the Borgias would find cause to destroy Alfonso as easily as they had others. They would not allow their heir to suffer such humiliation. And so the Este made a demand grotesque yet logical in their world. The marriage must be consummated, and that consummation must be beyond dispute. Not whispered about in private, not hidden behind bedroom curtains, but verified. Witnessed, recorded. In their eyes, only the indisputable evidence of flesh united could guarantee that Lucrezia and Alfonso's bond could not later be annulled under accusations of impotence or barrenness. The Este demanded not only a bride, but a guarantee. This practice, though shocking to modern sensibilities, was not entirely without precedent. Across Europe, dynasties had devised rituals to confirm fertility and consummation. In medieval France, newlyweds of noble blood were sometimes escorted to the marriage bed, in procession, with courtiers standing by as sheets were later displayed to prove virginity lost. In England, whispers swirled around royal weddings as chamberlains lingered outside doors to listen for signs of intimacy. Even in Spain, chronicles mention brides whose blood-stained linens were shown to secure dynastic claims. Intimacy was never wholly private for the powerful, it was a matter of state, a contract written upon the body. What set Lucrezia's case apart was its intensity. The Este were not content with vague assurances or symbolic gestures, they wanted certainty witnessed by their own eyes. And so after hours of feasting and spectacle after the songs and dances faded, the young bride and the groom would be led not into seclusion but into a chamber prepared as a stage. There in the dim glow of candlelight, the most private of acts would become a public ritual, a performance demanded by politics. This was the price of survival in Renaissance Italy. For Ferrara, the alliance promised protection against enemies. For the Borgias, it offered prestige, and the chance to graft their scandal-stained name onto the trunk of ancient nobility. For Lucrezia and Alfonso, it meant a wedding night transformed into negotiation, their bodies no longer their own, but tokens in a contract. And for the witnesses, it meant turning flesh into evidence, passion into protocol. It was not a marriage of love. It was a marriage of necessity, sealed not only with vows and feasts, but with the stripping of privacy, the subjugation of intimacy, and the cold scrutiny of politics masquerading as matrimony. The Vatican halls groaned under the weight of spectacle. For the Borgias, no wedding could be anything less than a stage on which power itself was performed. The banquet tables stretched endlessly, droning beneath mountains of delicacies brought from every corner of the papal dominion. Platters of roasted peacocks, their feathers reattached and gilded, so that the birds seemed to shimmer in death as they once had in life, were paraded through the hall. Wild boars stuffed with quail and pheasant-candied fruits glistening like jewels, sugared almonds dyed crimson and gold, every dish was less a meal than a declaration of wealth. Wine flowed like a river, dark red and sweet, carried in silver ewers by servants trained to move like shadows. Spices from the Levant, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, perfumed the air, proof of the papacy's reach across seas and deserts. And all around the tables, laughter rang out, mingled with the music of lutes, viols, and flutes, their harmonies climbing the frescoed ceilings as if trying to escape into the Roman night. The wedding feast of Lucrezia Borgia was theatre in its purest form. Guests arrived not only to celebrate but to be seen celebrating. Noble women in gowns stitched with pearls whispered behind feathered fans. Courtiers in velvet doublets exchanged calculated pleasantries, each word a wager, each glance a weapon. Dancers whirled in choreographed patterns, their silken sleeves catching the light of hundreds of candles. Masks, literal and metaphorical, covered every face, and such extravagance was not unique to Rome. In Florence, the Medici had once dazzled their city with feasts where allegorical tableaux unfolded between courses. In Milan, the Sforza had staged tournaments in which knights tilted beneath fireworks. And in Ferrara itself, the Este were famed for their festoi, where poets like Ludovico Ariosto recited verses in praise of their hosts. The Renaissance court feast was never merely a meal. It was politics in costume theatre dressed as devotion, a way of displaying power without drawing a sword. But within the glitter shadows lingered. For all the splendour of this wedding night, dread was the uninvited guest who sat at every table. The Este envoys did not drink deeply, their eyes darting toward their hosts as though every cup might conceal poison. Cesare Borgia's laughter carried a sharp edge, too loud, too deliberate, as if daring anyone to forget the corpses that lay behind his smile. Pope Alexander, presiding like a god among mortals, watched the festivities with the satisfaction of a man who knew he'd won for now. And at the centre of it all sat Lucrezia. Her beauty, luminous in the torchlight, was admired by many and envied by more. She moved gracefully, smiled when she must even lifted her goblet to the well-wishing throng. But beneath her calm exterior, she must have felt the weight of what awaited her after the feast. For her, the roasted peacocks and dancing minstrels were not distractions, but preludes to humiliation. The Ferrara envoy's demand for proof of consummation hung over her like a noose. The guests laughed yes. They applauded the jesters who juggled golden balls, they tapped their feet to the music, they gossiped about gowns and jewels. Yet even among the merriment whispers curled like smoke, would the Este truly go through with their demand? Would the bride be forced to prove herself in front of others? Some dismissed it as a rumour too grotesque to be real. Others, more cynical, merely nodded. This is Italy, after all. Nothing is too grotesque when power is at stake, and so the feast became a mask in itself. Outwardly a celebration glittering with all the riches of Rome. Inwardly a waiting room for a ritual that would strip away every illusion of intimacy. Joy and dread danced together that night just as surely as the minstrels played and the dancers spun. For Lucrezia, the banquet was a cage of gold, each laugh and cheer another bar. When the last course was cleared, when the last song died, she knew what lay ahead. Beyond the feast's brilliance, humiliation was waiting. As the last goblets were drained and the music softened into a whisper, the true heart of the night revealed itself. For Alfonso d'Este and Lucrezia Borgia, marriage was not secured with rings or vows, nor with the blessing of Pope Alexander himself. It would only be sealed when flesh had spoken louder than parchment. The Este envoys, their faces cold with resolve, had made their condition plain: the marriage must be consummated under witness. This was no idle cruelty, no sudden whim. It was the grim logic of dynasties. The Este family, old as marble and proud of their centuries of legitimacy, could not risk being ensnared in the same scandals that had consumed Lucrezia's first two marriages. They had seen Giovanni Sforza humiliated by accusations of impotence. They had watched Alfonso of Aragon murdered after whispers that he stood in Cesare Borgia's way. They knew that with the Borgias nothing was sacred, not even a wedding bed. If their heir Alfonso was to be bound to Lucrezia, there could be no escape route left open for papal cunning. The union must be consummated publicly and undeniably, so that no annulment could later be conjured, no rumour of barrenness or fraud used to sever the alliance. And so the grotesque demand not intimacy but verification. The couple would be escorted not into a private bridal chamber, but into a chamber staged for performance. Behind curtains drawn just enough for envoys and clerics to see, the consummation would take place, its success recorded like a notarial act. Though shocking to modern sensibilities that this practice was not entirely alien to the age. In medieval France, royal marriages sometimes ended with the bridal procession leading straight to the marriage bed. Courtiers would stand nearby as the sheets were blessed and later displayed stained with the proof of virginity lost. In England, chroniclers noted how the bedchamber was sometimes left deliberately ajar, with attendants listening for the sounds that testified to duty fulfilled. Even in Castile, chronicles mention linen displayed before noble witnesses offered, as evidence that the bride's body had done its part in sealing political compacts. For dynasties, fertility was not private, it was survival. A barren marriage meant no heirs, and no heirs meant the unravelling of treaties, claims, and empires. Legitimacy was not merely a question of love, but of lineage, and lineage was the currency of politics. A single whispered doubt about impotence, infertility, or adultery could dissolve the strongest alliance, plunging families into war. And so intimacy became a matter of state stripped of tenderness and reforged as evidence. The Este family's demand was harsh, but it was consistent with this world of brutal pragmatism. They could not afford to gamble this of their legacy, on trust, not with the Borgias, whose very name was synonymous with betrayal. They wanted not rumours, not hearsay, but proof, witnessed, sealed, and beyond dispute. Thus, beneath the silken draperies of the Vatican, joy gave way to dread. The feast had been the theatre, but what was about to follow would be theatre of a darker kind, a stage where the bride and groom themselves became the actors, their most private union transformed into a ritual of scrutiny, their bodies pressed into service as guarantees of power. For Lucrezia, who'd already suffered humiliation and loss at the hands of politics, the demand was not a surprise. But it was a wound, nonetheless a reminder that her body was not her own, that even her wedding night would be consumed by the appetites of men who saw her less as woman than as contract. And yet, as history would reveal, this very humiliation would be the forge in which she learned her most enduring lesson that what is meant to degrade can in the right hands be transmuted into power. The feast had ended, the last echoes of music dissolving into the stone corridors. Torches sputtered as the crowd thinned, but a select company did not retire. Instead, they followed Lucrezia and Alfonso, not with blessings, but with the cold precision of auditors. This was no bridal procession of laughter and flowers. It was a march toward scrutiny. The couple was led into a chamber prepared not for intimacy but for spectacle. It was a room heavy with symbolism, draperies of crimson and gold candles placed not for romance, but illumination, the bed itself set as though it were an altar. Yet it was no altar of love. It was a stage, its curtains drawn back just enough for shadows of witnesses to pass across the silken folds. There they stood, papal clerics appointed to record the Union envoys of Ferrara, tasked with verifying its legitimacy, and a handful of attendants who would later whisper of what they had seen. Their faces bore the strained solemnity of men who wished to look away but dared not. Eyes half averted, yet always returning sharp and watchful, ensuring that duty was fulfilled. They were not voyeurs, but notaries of the flesh scribes of a contract written in sweat and silence. For Lucrezia, the scene must have been suffocating. She who had already endured annulment and widowhood now found her third wedding night stripped of privacy. Every gesture, every sound, every shiver of candlelight upon her skin risked interpretation. For Alfonso, heir of Ferrara, the humiliation was no less acute. He was asked to prove not affection but potency, to display his virility before men who measured his worth not in character but consummation. The atmosphere was grotesque in its mixture, half solemn ritual, half macabre spectacle. The clerics murmured prayers as though sanctifying what was in truth a political act. The envoys stood rigid, their eyes sharp, their quills ready to inscribe the moment into record. Outside Rome's night hummed with the usual chaos laughter from taverns, footsteps of mercenaries, the distant tolling of bells. But inside this chamber silence reigned, broken only by the shuffle of robes, the flicker of flames, and the strained breathing of a bride and groom forced to play roles in a theatre not of their choosing. It was the strangest audience imaginable, men of God, men of politics, all gathered to witness what should have belonged to no one but two. Yet in Renaissance Italy, the body of a bride was not hers, it was property evidence and contract. Here in this chamber of silk and shadows, Lucrezia and Alfonso ceased to be simply man and woman. They were transformed into symbols, into guarantees, into instruments of alliance. The curtains swayed gently, torchlight trembling across the fabric. Behind them, the watchers leaned, peering through the narrow openings, their expressions caught between discomfort and duty. The stage had been set, the audience assembled, the actors unwilling yet compelled. In this grotesque masquerade marriage was stripped bare of tenderness and clothed instead in scrutiny, the most private of acts transfigured into a ritual of power. And as the night deepened, the witnesses would see what they came to see recording in their hearts and their ledgers. Not love, but the cold confirmation that Ferrara's heir and the Pope's daughter were now bound in flesh as well as name. The chamber fell into a silence that was heavier than stone. Behind the parted curtains, the select witnesses leaned forward not with desire, but with a strange, almost clerical vigilance. And before them, Lucrezia and Alfonso performed not as lovers, but as actors in a ritual choreographed by suspicion and necessity. The consummation of their marriage was no private surrender, no sacred binding of two souls. It was a political act stripped bare of tenderness and remade as evidence. Every movement carried the weight of dynasties, every breath was measured by the eyes fixed upon them. What should have been a union whispered in the dark was instead a proclamation, a declaration written on flesh for the sake of Ferrara's archives and Rome's chronicles. The Este envoys demanded certainty, and so the act was not completed once, but repeated twice, and even a third time according to the whispers that spread like wildfire after that night. Each repetition was a seal, each confirmation an iron nail hammered into the coffin of doubt. Lucrezia's body, already politicized since childhood, was once more transformed into a guarantee. She was no longer simply a woman or a bride. She was proof incarnate, proof of her own fertility, proof of Alfonso's virility, proof that the alliance could not be undone by whispers of impotence or fraud. This was the grotesque theatre of Renaissance politics, but it was not unique to Rome. Across Europe, the beds of queens and princesses had long been stages where privacy ended and politics began. In medieval France, the bedding ceremony was conducted with attendants guiding the couple to their chamber, then waiting to inspect the linens for blood that would confirm the bride's virginity. In England, the court gathered outside closed doors, straining for sounds that would testify that the king's line might yet continue. In Spain, the nuptial sheets themselves were paraded, displayed like holy relics to certify purity lost and dynasty secured. But in Rome that night, the Borgia-Este union was pushed to its cruelest extreme. The witnesses did not merely wait outside the chamber. or inspect the aftermath. They peered in as the act itself unfolded, their solemn faces, illuminated by candlelight, their presence pressing down like a judgment. The marriage bed, meant in other circumstances to be a sanctuary, was turned into a tribunal. Flesh itself became parchment. Pleasure, if there was any, was erased by the scratching of invisible pens across imagined ledgers. The humiliation was profound, yet within it lay a paradoxical strength. For in completing this ritual, Lucrezia emerged with something undeniable. The very act designed to strip her of dignity gave her a shield against future slander. No one could question her legitimacy as Alfonso's wife. No one could annul her marriage on the grounds that had once destroyed her union with Giovanni Sforza. The Este had their guarantee, Rome had its spectacle, and Lucrezia, humiliated yet unbroken, carried forward with the knowledge that survival sometimes meant enduring what others could not. And so, as the whispers spread through Italy of a bride forced to prove herself before an audience of a marriage, sealed not in love but in ceremony of flesh, the meaning of that night was twisted into legend. Some called it grotesque, others pragmatic, but for Lucrezia, it was another lesson carved into her life that her body was not her own, that in the game of power intimacy was merely another battlefield, and that if she wished to endure, she must learn to turn even this into leverage. For most women, such a night would have been nothing but a wound. The loss of privacy, the indignity of being reduced to spectacle, the memory of faces peering in at the most vulnerable of moments. Yet for Lucrezia Borgia, humiliation was never the end of the story. It was paradoxically the beginning of her strength. The Este envoys had demanded proof. They left with it duly recorded, and the matter was settled. Lucrezia was not barren. Alfonso was potent, and their union could not be annulled. What they meant as a cage became for her a shield. For the rest of her life in Ferrara, no one could challenge the legitimacy of her marriage. No whisper of impotence, no accusation of infertility could unravel what had been performed, witnessed, and sealed. In a world where women's worth was measured in their ability to secure dynasties, this grotesque ordeal ironically armed her with undeniable authority. This was the moment when Lucrezia learned the lesson that would shape her path, that humiliation once endured can be transformed into leverage. Where others might shrink into shame, she leaned into survival. She understood that the spectacle was not just about her degrading, but also about her proof, and proof was power. Her very body, so often manipulated as a pawn, now bore a certification that protected her against annulment, gossip, and dismissal. The psychological resilience required for such a transformation is difficult to fathom. She had lived through annulment, through the public slander of impotence, through the violent murder of a husband she may have loved. Each time she had been forced to endure the crushing weight of scandal, and yet each time she adapted. With Sforza she survived humiliation. With Alfonso of Aragon she endured grief. With Alfonso d'Este she converted humiliation into weaponry. This capacity to absorb what was meant to destroy her and repurpose it into strength set her apart from so many other women trapped in dynastic games. Where Catherine Howard of England would later fall under the weight of her reputation, or Anne of Brittany would be broken by the endless demand for heirs, Lucrezia found a way to navigate to bend without breaking. Her ordeal became her protection. When she stepped into Ferrara, she did not carry only the stigma of being a Borgia. She carried the indelible fact of her legitimacy as duchies, and she would wield that fact like armour, a silent but impenetrable defence against those who sought to belittle her. The Este family, wary though they remained, could no longer doubt her place. She had been tested in the cruelest possible way, and she had survived. Thus what began as a grotesque spectacle ended as a paradoxical victory. Lucrezia's dignity had been stripped, yes, but in its place she found something even more enduring, a platform upon which to build her power. The lesson was brutal, but it was one she would never forget, and in the years to come she would prove again and again that humiliation once mastered can be transformed into the foundation of a throne. When Lucrezia Borgia finally left Rome behind and entered Ferrara, she did so not as an innocent bride, but as a woman forged in scandal. Her arrival was accompanied by processions, music, and carefully staged ceremony, yet beneath the pageantry suspicion lingered. For the Este family she was a prize and a danger all at once, the daughter of a pope whose name was synonymous with corruption, the sister of Cesare Borgia, whose shadow stretched across Italy like a blade. Ferrara, however, was no ordinary court. Unlike the volatile politics of Rome where poison and rumour reigned, Ferrara prided itself on refinement and humanist learning. Here, dukes and duchesses cultivated not only armies but culture. The court had long been a beacon of the Renaissance where artists, scholars and poets flourished under Este patronage. Ariosto would one day compose his great Orlando Furioso in these halls. Musicians experimented with polyphony in Ferrara's chapels, their harmonies spilling like threads of gold through candlelit chambers. Even the city itself reflected this spirit, streets paved with order, palaces designed with symmetry, a place where beauty and intellect were marshalled as forms of power. Yet into this cultivated world stepped Lucrezia, carrying with her the infamy of the Borgia name. Many in Ferrara's court whispered doubts: would she corrupt their house with scandal? Would she bring the taint of Rome's debauchery into their halls? Chroniclers note that Duke Urkel himself, Alfonso's father, had resisted the match until the very last, yielding only when necessity outweighed pride. Lucrezia understood these doubts. She knew she entered a court that valued dignity, refinement and continuity, all the qualities her family seemed to lack, and so she adjusted. If Rome had forced her to survive by enduring humiliation, Ferrara required a different strategy reinvention. She began by embracing the cultural identity of her new home. Where once she had been framed as a temptress, she now presented herself as a patroness. She opened her doors to scholars and poets, filling her salons with debates on Plato verses in Italian and Latin, and music that stirred both intellect and soul. She dressed not in the flamboyant excesses that Rome associated with the Borgias, but in a style that balanced elegance with restraint, her gowns tailored to reflect Ferrara's sober refinement. She walked not as the Pope's pawn, but as the Duchess whose grace could elevate the Este court. Her strategic adjustment was more than surface. She learned the language of Ferrara, its rhythms of diplomacy, its reliance on culture as armour, its pride in continuity. Where Rome had thrived on spectacle and intimidation, Ferrara thrived on subtlety. And Lucrezia, quick to learn, mirrored what the Este valued most. She transformed herself into a symbol of stability and sophistication, slowly disarming the suspicions that had shadowed her entry. Still, whispers remained. Some courtiers never ceased to see her as a Borgia at heart, a woman whose smile might conceal poison, whose beauty might mask deceit. But even suspicion began to shift as the years passed. The woman they had expected to scandalize Ferrara began instead to enrich it, turning gossip into admiration, transforming her presence from a liability into an asset. Her entrance into Ferrara was not merely the crossing of a threshold, it was the beginning of a transformation. In Rome she had been pawn and spectacle. In Ferrara she would become something more: a duchess who learned to wield grace as strategy, culture as weapon, and refinement as the antidote to scandal. In Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia began to weave the fabric of her reinvention with deliberate care, thread by thread. If her wedding night had been a public humiliation designed to reduce her to flesh, her years in Ferrara became a performance of the mind and the spirit. She understood the character of her new home. This was not Rome where fear and spectacle ruled, but Ferrara where art, humanism and refinement carried as much weight as armies. And so she built her power not through intimidation but through culture. Her palace apartments soon became gathering places for Italy's brightest minds. She hosted salons that glittered not with jewels or scandal, but with intellect and wit. Scholars and poets were welcomed into her circle where conversation flowed like music. It is said that Ludovico Ariosto, who would later write Orlando Furioso, found inspiration in Ferrara's courtly atmosphere, where Lucrezia herself listened to verses and offered patronage. Pietro Bembo, the humanist whose writings on love and language shaped Italian Renaissance thought, was also drawn into her orbit, exchanging letters with Lucrezia that still shimmer with elegance and restraint. Music too found in her a devoted patroness. The Este court was renowned for its Concerto delle Donne, an ensemble of female musicians whose innovations in madrigal singing captivated Italy. Under Lucrezia's encouragement, Ferrara became a place where music stretched toward new heights of complexity and beauty. She attended performances not as a passive spectator, but as an engaged participant, her presence lending prestige and protection to those who dared experiment. In her halls, the blending of voices became both art and allegory, harmony forged out of difference, beauty born of discipline. Lucrezia also turned her gaze to religion, carefully curating an image of piety that countered the rumours that had trailed her from Rome. She funded convents, supported charitable works, and sponsored devotional art that cast her as both duchess and servant of God. In commissioning altarpieces and sacred paintings, she placed her name and image alongside saints, folding herself into the fabric of Ferrara's spiritual life. To her detractors, this was reputation laundering. To her admirers, it was proof that the scandalous daughter of Alexander VI had transformed into the virtuous Duchess of Ferrara. The effect was gradual but undeniable. Where once courtiers had whispered of her as a Borgia temptress, now they spoke of her as a refined hostess, a patroness of letters and music, a duchess whose salons were the envy of Italy. The transformation was not total rumours never died entirely, but she managed something rare. She bent gossip into admiration. Even her elegance became a kind of armour. Visitors remarked not only on her beauty but on her composure, her balance of modesty and brilliance. She dazzled not by scandal but by charm, by creating a stage where she, not her detractors, controlled the script. This was Lucrezia's true art, the art of transformation. She understood that reputation was malleable, that scandal could be softened by grace, and that even a name as infamous as Borgia could be reshaped through culture and piety. By embracing Ferrara's love of refinement, she turned herself from pawn into duchess, from object of suspicion into beacon of admiration. And perhaps most impressively, she did so not by denying her past, but by overshadowing it. Rome had reduced her to humiliation, but Ferrara would remember her for music, poetry, and grace. Where once her body had been proof, now her intellect and taste became her true signature. If Lucrezia's salons and patronage reshaped her image among scholars and courtiers, it was her conduct and governance that truly secured her reputation in Ferrara. For when Alfonso was away, whether at war overseeing fortifications or embroiled in diplomatic campaigns, it was Lucrezia who held the reins of power. And unlike her role in Rome, where she had been a pawn moved by her father and brother, here she acted with a measure of independence that astonished her contemporaries. Letters preserved in Ferrara's archives show Lucrezia issuing decrees in Alfonso's absence, her signature carrying the weight of ducal authority. She oversaw disputes between guilds, arbitrated conflicts among landowners, and ensured that taxes flowed steadily into the coffers. Chroniclers remarked on her composure and fairness, describing a duchess who listened attentively, before rendering judgment one who valued stability above favouritism. She even had a hand in the delicate world of finances. Ferrara, though wealthy in culture, was not immune to the perpetual money troubles that plagued Renaissance courts. Lucrezia worked to balance extravagance with necessity, ensuring that the duchy could fund both its defences and its celebrations without collapsing under debt. It is telling that Duke Urkel, once so resistant to her marriage, came to value her presence in the ducal household, recognising that she contributed not only beauty and airs, but order and prudence. The people of Ferrara, too, grew to admire her. For while noble courts often seemed detached from the lives of commoners, Lucrezia took care to cultivate a reputation for compassion. She supported charitable causes, funded convents and hospitals, and earned the devotion of those who might otherwise have resented the extravagance of their rulers. In time, she came to be known among her subjects as La Buona Duchessa, the Good Duchess. It was a title not lightly given, and one that few women of her era achieved. Her role as a female ruler even temporarily placed her in the company of remarkable contemporaries. Isabella d'Este, her sister-in-law, and perhaps the most celebrated woman of the Italian Renaissance, had long commanded respect in Mantua for her political skill and cultural patronage. Caterina Sforza, remembered as the Lioness of Forlì, had defended her fortress against invading armies with the ferocity of a general. Lucrezia did not wield weapons as Caterina did, nor did she dominate with Isabella's brilliance. Instead, she carved her own niche, a ruler whose strength was quiet, whose influence was subtle but profound, who transformed scandal into stability. In this way, she demonstrated that power could be exercised in many forms. Where men often measured authority in swords and treaties, Lucrezia wielded governance as a careful balancing act, the pen instead of the blade, diplomacy instead of domination. She was no less effective for it. Indeed, her ability to command respect without force made her presence all the more striking. Through governance, Lucrezia completed the third stage of her transformation. From pawn to patroness, and from patroness to ruler, she forged an identity that neither Rome's whispers nor Ferrara's suspicions could erase. She proved not only that she could survive humiliation, but that she could rise above it, reshaping herself into a duchess beloved by her people and trusted by her court. Lucrezia Borgia had learned that words could wound as deeply as blades. Rumours of poison, incest, and scandal had followed her from Rome, like shadows clinging to her name. But in Ferrara she discovered a weapon that could cut sharper than gossip culture. Patronage became her armour art, her shield, and devotion her sword. If her body had once been used as proof, her legacy would now be carved in marble, painted in fresco, and sung in madrigal. She commissioned works that blended magnificence with restraint, signalling both wealth and piety. Altarpieces adorned with her likeness in prayer appeared in Ferrara's churches, folding her image into the visual vocabulary of devotion. By funding convents and hospitals, she turned acts of charity into monuments of memory, places where prayers were offered daily in her name. Even her choice of artists and musicians was deliberate. Every painter's brushstroke, every hymn sung in a chapel, every madrigal composed under her patronage helped weave her reputation into the very fabric of Ferrara's culture. This was not vanity, it was strategy. In Renaissance Italy, where scandal could destroy a dynasty, women of power often turned to art and religion to launder their reputations. Isabella d'Este, Lucrezia's sister-in-law, had perfected the practice in Mantua, surrounding herself with masterpieces that cast her not as scandalous or frivolous, but as a paragon of learning and refinement. Caterina Sforza, whose ferocity on the battlefield shocked contemporaries, softened her image through religious endowments that cast her as both warrior and pious matron. Lucrezia followed this path with equal cunning, using patronage as a kind of stagecraft, directing what her subjects saw, felt, and remembered. She also understood the power of spectacle. Religious processions, festivals, and public ceremonies offered opportunities to display both her devotion and her authority. Draped in sombre gowns for holy days, glittering in pearls and jewels for civic celebrations, Lucrezia became a living icon, embodying Ferrara's wealth and sanctity at once. These rituals were not frivolities, they were political theatre. To the people, she was no longer just a daughter of Rome's corruption, but the duchess who prayed alongside them, who adorned their altars, who celebrated their festivals. Her patronage extended into the intimate realms of literature and music as well. Pietro Bembo's letters to her, full of grace and classical allusion, reveal not only admiration but respect. The madrigals performed at her court placed Ferrara at the forefront of musical innovation, turning her salons into cultural beacons. By elevating Ferrara's reputation, she elevated her own, proving that scandal could be overshadowed by splendour. In this way, culture became Lucrezia's armour. Where swords and decrees might falter, art endured. A fresco on a chapel wall outlived gossip. A madrigal sung in her honour lingered longer than slander. Patronage wisely deployed transformed her from a figure of suspicion into a duchess whose presence radiated legitimacy. By cloaking herself in art, faith and refinement, Lucrezia mastered the Renaissance. Truth, image was power. Her enemies had weaponized rumour. She answered with monuments, music, and memory. And in the end, it was these cultural legacies, not the whispers of poison, that Ferrara chose to remember. If Ferrara celebrated Lucrezia as a duchess of grace and patronage, the woman herself remained elusive, retreating behind words crafted with deliberate care. Much of what we know of her inner life comes from her letters, hundreds of them written to diplomats, relatives, courtiers, and churchmen. Yet even in these pages where one might expect candour, Lucrezia is more mask than confession, more strategist than diarist. The letters are meticulously polite, often warm, and sometimes even tender. She writes of prayers, of household matters, of her concern for children, of requests made with humility. Yet rarely do they reveal bitterness or unguarded anger. When her husband Alfonso was imprisoned by papal forces years later, her letters pleading for his release were dignified and restrained, never hysterical. When she corresponded with her father or brother, her words bore the practiced neutrality of a woman who knew that ink could damn as easily as it could persuade. Take her exchanges with Pietro Bembo, the Venetian humanist. Their letters, filled with quotations from Petrarch and classical imagery, dance with charm and refinement. Some scholars read them as flirtatious, others as intellectual play. But what is certain is that they reveal Lucrezia's command of tone, how she could cloak herself in the language of poetry, presenting not scandalous passion, but cultivated elegance. Even in intimacy, she projected image rather than exposing vulnerability. And so the question lingers, was this evasiveness born of caution or of mastery? Did she resent the roles forced upon her pawn-bride duchess and conceal her true thoughts for fear of exposure, or did she deliberately sculpt her persona? Understanding that in a world ravenous for gossip, control of her own Narrative was her greatest protection. Her stipulance on certain matters is as telling as her words. When scandal engulfed her in Rome, whispers of incest tales, of poison, her letters do not rage against the slander. They do not even acknowledge it. She chose instead to redirect attention writing of piety of duties of culture. Her refusal to engage became its own form of resistance. She denied her enemies the satisfaction of confirming or denying their tales. Even her correspondence with her children carries this quality of restraint. She expresses affection, yes, but rarely exposes her own fears or doubts. It is as though she believed that even the bond between mother and child could be turned into weaponry by a world eager to scrutinize her. This enigmatic quality explains why Lucrezia continues to fascinate. We know she suffered, that she lost children, that she endured the deaths of loved ones. Yet her own voice never lingers on despair. We know she was suspected, accused, slandered. Yet she left behind no confessions, no outbursts. Instead, her words are veils thin enough to reveal her intelligence and grace, but thick enough to obscure her deepest self. In this way, her letters mirror her life, carefully measured, strategically composed, never allowing outsiders to see more than she intended. Did she resent the humiliations of her wedding night? Did she feel trapped or triumphant? The letters never tell us outright. But perhaps that silence itself was her victory. By mastering the art of self-presentation, Lucrezia denied history the ability to define her entirely. She became instead the author of her own mystery. Even as Lucrezia built her identity in Ferrara, patroness of art, good duchess, careful correspondent, the long shadow of the Borgia name never lifted entirely. It crept into the corners of every hall she walked, whispered behind her back, at every feast, etched into every rumour that touched her children. To the Este courtiers she was always more than herself. She was the living echo of Rome's most infamous clan. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, was remembered less for his papal decrees than for his appetite for wealth and power. His reign had become a byword for corruption, a symbol wielded by reformers and enemies of the papacy alike. Satirical poems circulated across Europe painting the Borgia Pope as a gluttonous beast, a man who filled the Vatican with bastards and banquets. The reformers would later seize on this image, using it as evidence of Rome's rot. Every indulgence Lucrezia enjoyed in Ferrara was in some minds purchased by that reputation. And then there was Cesare, her brother, beautiful, brilliant and terrifying. His campaigns across central Italy had enthralled even Niccolo Machiavelli, who saw in Cesare a model for his treatise on power. To Machiavelli, Cesare was the embodiment of political genius, ruthless, decisive, able to inspire fear and loyalty in equal measure. To most others, however, he was the spectre of ambition, unbound, a man who strangled rivals with his own hands and lured allies to their deaths with promises of peace. Wherever Lucrezia went, Cesare's image preceded her, the brother who killed the brother, who protected the brother, whose obsessive devotion to her was the subject of endless speculation. The cultural world feasted on such scandals. Italian dramatists and chroniclers turned the Borgias into grotesque archetypes. Plays whispered of incest, of poison-laced rings, of papal orgies, where Lucrezia was cast as both victim and temptress. Pamphlets circulated through Venice and Florence filled with caricatures of the devil Pope and his serpent children. Even when Lucrezia governed well in Ferrara, even when she prayed devoutly or commissioned altarpieces, these stories clung to her like smoke. The world preferred the myth of the Borgia femme fatale to the reality of a duchess balancing accounts and issuing decrees. Such shadows were not entirely beyond her control, however. In Ferrara, she worked to redirect them to overwrite the Borgia narrative with Este stability. Yet even as she succeeded locally, the larger European imagination never let go. To poets and pamphleteers, she remained forever the daughter of Alexander, the sister of Cesare. The scandals of Rome were too delicious, too scandalous to be forgotten, and so her identity became a strange duality. Within Ferrara, she was admired, even beloved. Beyond Ferrara, she was infamous, her name a cipher for corruption and seduction. History, as it often does, preserved the shadows more vividly than the light. The whispers of her family's crimes followed her into every chamber, into every judgment of her character, long after she had proved herself something more. This was the burden of her bloodline to live as both woman and symbol, as Lucrezia the Duchess and Lucrezia the Borgia. The tension between these two selves would never fully resolve. For every act of grace she performed, there was a chronicler eager to remind the world of the poison in her veins, beneath the glittering facade of Ferrara's Duchess. lay a woman marked by sorrow. Lucrezia Borgia's life, so often narrated as scandal or spectacle, also carried the quieter rhythm of grief, a grief carefully hidden behind the mask of magnificence she wore for the world. Ferrara's chronicles describe her as radiant in public, the duchess who presided over salons, who dazzled visitors with grace, who processed through the streets on holy days like a living icon. She embodied dignity and serenity, her poise so complete that it seemed unshakable. Yet behind palace walls, Lucrezia endured a life punctuated by loss. She bore many children, but not all survived. Contemporary accounts note her deep attachment to her offspring, her letters filled with concern for their health and futures. When one of her sons died in infancy, courtiers recorded her retreat into prayer, her chambers darkened, her meals untouched. A woman expected to be the smiling face of Ferrara's glory was in private a mother, mourning with the rawness that rank and titles could never dull. Her marriage to Alfonso, though steady, was not one of easy intimacy. He was often absent overseeing Ferrara's defences, building its famous artillery, negotiating with foreign powers. The chronicles suggest that she sometimes found herself isolated, surrounded by courtiers who watched her every move yet offered little companionship. It was in such solitude that she turned to correspondence to her children and to piety for solace. And yet when she stepped into public view, none of this sorrow was permitted to show. Ferrara expected magnificence, and she delivered it unfailingly. Dressed in velvet and pearls, she presided over courtly entertainments with effortless charm. She walked in religious processions as though untouched by scandal, a duchess whose composure seemed carved from marble. Visitors from other courts wrote of her elegance, her gracious manner, her ability to turn suspicion into admiration. They saw the mask, not the grief. This dual existence was the essence of Lucrezia's survival. In an age when women were political instruments, she understood that the private self could never be allowed to interfere with the public role. Grief had to be contained within chapel walls, loneliness hidden behind jewelled gowns, sorrow transmuted into piety. The duchess who mourned in private became the duchess who inspired in public. The chronicles of Ferrara preserve both glimpses, the woman who fasted and prayed in mourning, and the woman who presided over feasts that made her court renowned across Italy. They rarely overlap. It is as though her life was divided into two scripts, one written for her own heart, the other staged for history. And perhaps that division was her greatest performance. For Lucrezia knew that in Ferrara, she was not only a woman, but a symbol, a living embodiment of the Este dynasty's dignity. She could not show the fragility of her private self without risking the strength of her public mask. So she carried both side by side, grief within, magnificence without, and in that balance lay the secret of her endurance. Lucrezia Borgia's story is not only one of scandal and spectacle, it is above all one of survival. Few women of her age endured so much public degradation, and yet emerged with dignity and tact. Where others were consumed by rumour or destroyed by politics, she learned to bend with the storms, to reshape herself when circumstances demanded it, and to wield the tools of her age, beauty, grace culture, and silence as weapons more potent than steel. She survived annulment when Giovanni Sforza was branded impotent, and her own reputation dragged through mud. She survived widowhood when Alfonso of Aragon was stabbed and strangled under the shadow of her brother Cesare's ambition. She survived the grotesque humiliation of Ferrara's demand when her wedding night became a performance. And in each case she did not allow herself to be broken. She adapted. She redefined herself. She shifted the narrative from victim to duchess, from scandal to patroness. This resilience places her in the company of other women who navigated the treacherous terrain of patriarchal courts. Isabella d'Este, her sister-in-law, deployed intellect and taste to dominate Mantua's politics, mastering diplomacy in a world that excluded women from official power. Caterina Sforza, the fierce lioness of Forlì, defended her fortress against invading armies with the defiance of a general. Anne of Brittany, twice Queen of France, secured her duchy's autonomy through relentless negotiation, even as she endured the death of child after child. Lucrezia's strategies were subtler but no less effective. Unlike Caterina, she did not raise armies. Unlike Isabella, she did not shine as the unrivaled arbiter of taste. Instead, she weaponized adaptability. She took what was meant to shame her and turned it into leverage. She let her silence speak louder than denial, refusing to dignify the worst rumours with response. She leaned into Ferrara's cultural identity, using patronage to overwrite her Borgia infamy with Este refinement. She built alliances not only with noble houses, but with poets, musicians, clerics, and the people of Ferrara itself. Her resilience was not the resilience of defiance but of transformation. She understood that in a world where women's bodies and reputations were pawns, survival required playing the game better than the men who set the rules. Each reinvention was both protection and ascent, a careful reshaping of identity that allowed her not merely to endure but to thrive. By the time her life in Ferrara had reached its maturity, Lucrezia was no longer seen only as the Pope's daughter or Cesare's sister. She was the Duchess who governed competently in Alfonso's absence, the patroness who turned Ferrara into a beacon of Renaissance culture, the mother whose children secured the continuation of the Este line. She had outlasted her enemies and transformed her legacy from pawn to matriarch. Her story demonstrates the variety of strategies women employed in patriarchal courts to survive. Some fought with weapons, some with words, others with lineage. Lucrezia fought with reinvention. In the theatre of power, she mastered the art of survival by making herself indispensable first as proof, then as patroness, and finally as duchess. And so what history remembers as scandal and humiliation also conceals a deeper truth. Lucrezia's resilience was not accidental. It was strategy, deliberate, calculated, and astonishingly effective. By the time Lucrezia Borgia reached her later years in Ferrara, the transformation was complete. The young bride who had entered the Este court under suspicion, burdened by scandal and humiliation, had become something far greater a ruler in her own right, a duchess whose authority was respected not merely because of her lineage, but because of the life she had built. No longer the pawn of her father's papacy or her brother's ambition, she had become the linchpin of Ferrara's stability. When Alfonso d'Este was absent, whether at war or entangled in Italy's ever-shifting alliances, it was Lucrezia who governed. She did so not as a figurehead, but as a steady hand, issuing decrees, managing resources, and maintaining the delicate balance between the duchy's pride and its survival. Chroniclers who once whispered of her with suspicion now wrote of her prudence and moderation. Her life was marked by contradictions, but contradictions she learned to embody rather than resist. She was both Borgia and Este, child of scandal, yet matron of stability. She bore children securing the Este line, yet she also bore grief, losing more than one to the cruelties of fate. She cultivated magnificence, surrounding herself with poets, painters, and musicians, yet in her private moments she sought refuge in religion, fasting, confessing, and retreating to prayer. By the time she died in 1519 at the age of 39, Ferrara mourned her not as an outsider, but as their duchess. The people called her La Buona Duchessa, the Good Duchess, a title earned not through beauty or scandal, but through years of service and dignity. The very court that had once resisted her marriage honoured her as one of its finest rulers. And yet there is an irony that history cannot ignore. The throne she came to command, the respect she built, the legacy she left, was founded upon humiliation. The grotesque spectacle of her wedding night, the audience that turned her body into proof, was meant to cage her, to strip her of privacy, and reduce her to nothing more than contract. Instead, it became the foundation of her security, the shield that protected her from annulment and suspicion, the moment that forced her to transform humiliation into leverage. From that night forward, she lived not as pawn, but as strategist, as a woman who understood better than most the cruelty of power and how to bend it into survival. Her throne was not gifted. It was wrested from the very forces that sought to break her. Her legacy, therefore, is double-edged. To the world beyond Ferrara, she remained forever shadowed by her family name, her story coloured by scandal, gossip, and rumour. But within Ferrara, she was remembered as Duchess, Mother, Patroness, Ruler. Both portraits are true and both are incomplete. Together they form the paradox of Lucrezia Borgia, a woman whose greatest strength was forged in her deepest humiliations, whose rise to power was built upon the very stage meant to degrade her. History rarely grants women of her age such transformations, yet Lucrezia, with resilience sharpened by necessity, achieved it. She stepped into Ferrara a scandal and left it a sovereign. Lucrezia Borgia's story is not a tale of innocence preserved nor of virtue rewarded. It is a story of survival in a world that left women little room to maneuver. Her life reminds us that power, especially in Renaissance Italy, was not confined to thrones or battlefields. It reached into bedrooms, bodies, and the most intimate corners of human existence. And when intimacy itself was politicized, survival required something rarer than strength. It required transformation. Her wedding night, turned into a grotesque public ritual, was meant to cage her forever in humiliation. Instead, she made it the foundation of her legitimacy. Where others saw disgrace, she extracted leverage. Where others would have been crushed by shame, she fashioned armour. In this, she embodied a lesson that still resonates: humiliation need not be the end of power, it can become its seed. Her story also speaks to the collision of privacy and politics. In a world where dynasties measured survival in heirs and alliances, no act was too private to be exposed, no intimacy too sacred to be weaponized. The marriage bed became a tribunal, the bride's body a document to be read and verified. Lucrezia's ordeal forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth when unchecked power devours not only public life, but the sanctity of the private self. And yet within this oppressive system, Lucrezia's resilience shone. She adapted when her first marriage ended in ridicule. She endured when her second was soaked in blood. She reinvented herself when Ferrara demanded dignity and refinement. Through patronage, through governance, through the careful crafting of her own image, she transcended the role of pawn to become a duchess remembered with respect. In this, she joins the company of countless women across history who denied the weapons men took for granted, turned survival into an art. She could not command armies, but she could command perception. She could not raise rumour, but she could overshadow it with patronage and piety. She could not escape the system, but she could bend it until it carried her upward. Her story reminds us that survival within oppression is not weakness. It is its own form of power, a quieter power, but one that outlasts armies and poisons alike. For when her father's papacy collapsed and her brother's empire of blood crumbled, Lucrezia remained. She endured. She governed. She was mourned as La Buona Duchessa, the good duchess, a woman who turned scandal into stability, humiliation into heritage. And so her life leaves us with a haunting cadence that in the great theatre of power, even the most intimate of humiliations can be transformed into a throne. Rome may have remembered her as a scandal, but Ferrara remembered her as sovereign. Between those two truths lies the lesson of her life that dignity can be rebuilt from ashes, that resilience can flourish even under shadows, and that history, for all its cruelty, sometimes preserves not the shame of a woman, but the strength she forged from it. The lessons of Lucrezia Borgia. Humiliation, resilience, and the mask of power. History often remembers Lucrezia Borgia as a figure of scandal, whispers of poison, rumours of incest, the daughter of a pope whose court became a byword for corruption. Yet when we look closer beyond the gossip and the grotesque stories, her life reveals something far more enduring, a blueprint for survival in an oppressive system, and lessons about resilience that remain strikingly relevant today. The first lesson is this: humiliation does not have to be the end of your story. Lucrezia's wedding night, transformed into a public ritual in which witnesses verified her intimacy, was designed to strip her of dignity. And yet she turned that degradation into leverage. By enduring what others demanded, she emerged with undeniable legitimacy as Duchess of Ferrara, her marriage forever protected against annulment. In life, we too encounter moments of embarrassment, rejection, or exposure. The question is not whether we will face them, it is whether we will allow them to define us, or whether, like Lucrezia, we can reshape them into stepping stones toward greater strength. The second lesson is about resilience in the face of forces beyond our control. Lucrezia's first marriage ended in scandal, her skin in blood, her reputation scarred by the ambitions of others. Yet she refused to be destroyed by what she could not prevent. Instead, she adapted, reinventing herself as patroness, governor, and beloved duchess. Modern life is also filled with circumstances outside our control: economic downturns, illness, betrayal. What matters most is not what happens to us, but how we respond, how we absorb, adapt, and transform adversity into opportunity. A third lesson lies in her use of culture and image as armour. In Ferrara, Lucrezia drowned out scandal with salons filled with poets, musicians, and scholars. She funded convents and hospitals, commissioning works of art that embedded her name in devotion and refinement rather than infamy. She understood that reputation is not fixed, it can be reshaped. Today we may not commission altarpieces, but we still curate how we are seen through our actions, our words, our contributions. We have the same power to let our deeds speak louder than rumours. Finally, her story warns us about the dangers of unchecked power invading the private self. Lucrezia's body was never hers alone. It was a contract, a guarantee, a political tool. Her wedding bed became a courtroom. And while our world is different, we still see how surveillance, exploitation, or social pressure can erode the boundaries of privacy. Her life reminds us of the importance of defending those boundaries, of insisting that some spaces remain ours alone, free from judgment or control. Lucrezia Borgia's legacy is not merely scandal. It is resilience forged in fire, dignity rebuilt from disgrace, and the quiet power of reinvention. She teaches us that survival within oppression is not weakness, but strategy. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is this: even when life forces us onto a stage we did not choose, we can still decide how the play will end. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.